Melanie had counted every prisoner who walked free that morning. 37. 37 sets of footsteps shuffling past her cell toward the iron gates. 37 voices murmuring confused gratitude to the guards who unlocked their chains. She pressed her back against the damp stone wall and listened, and with every echo that faded, the silence that followed grew heavier, because the footsteps never stopped at her door. She didn't know yet that the man giving the orders wasn't just any king. She didn't know that he'd ridden through the night from the northern territories with a single name on his lips. Hers. The dungeon beneath Ashenmere Keep smelled the way all dungeons did after years of neglect. Mildew and old iron and something faintly sweet that Melanie had long stopped trying to identify. She'd been here for 4 months. 4 months since Lord Hargrove had dragged her from her village and thrown her into this pit on charges so thin they dissolved in the telling. Theft of enchanted grain, they'd said. Conspiracy against the provincial lord. Crimes so absurd that no magistrate had even bothered with a trial. The real reason was simpler. She'd refused him. Hargrove had come to her family's mill wanting more than flour, and when Melanie had looked him dead in the eye and told him she would rather starve, he'd made sure she did. Her mother and younger brother were still out there somewhere, she hoped. She had no way of knowing. She pulled the fraying hem of her slate-blue tunic over her knees and tucked herself tighter into the corner. The fabric had once been bright, almost warm-looking. Now it was dull and streaked with grime, but she kept it as clean as she could. It was the last thing her mother had stitched for her. She wasn't letting it go. Another set of footsteps, but these were different, heavy, deliberate. Not the shuffling gait of a freed prisoner or the brisk clip of a guard. These boots struck the stone floor like they owned it, like they owned everything the stone was built upon. Melanie's pulse picked up. She drew her knees closer and kept her breathing even, the way she'd taught herself to do whenever the guards came too close. Show nothing. Give them nothing. The torchlight from the corridor shifted and a shadow fell across the bars of her cell. Broad shoulders, tall, taller than anyone she'd seen in this place. The light caught the edge of a dark wool cloak lined with silver fur, and beneath it, the glint of blackened armor that looked like it had been forged from the night sky itself. Then she saw his face. Sharp jaw. A scar that ran from the corner of his left eye down to the hinge of his jaw. Pale against tanned skin. Dark hair pushed back from his forehead, slightly damp, like he'd been traveling in the rain. And his eyes. She noticed his eyes before anything else because they were already looking at her. Not past her, not through her, at her. They were the color of winter amber, deep gold with flecks of something darker, and they burned with an intensity that made Melanie's stomach drop. Not with fear, with something she didn't have a name for. A guard scrambled up behind him, keys jangling. "Your Majesty, this one is... she's... The charges are from Lord Hargrove's jurisdiction. We weren't given orders to... Open it." 2 words. Low. Final. The kind of voice that didn't need volume to command absolute silence. The guard fumbled with the lock. The door groaned open, and the man stepped inside her cell. Melanie didn't move. She kept her chin level, kept her eyes on his, and refused to shrink. She had learned in this dungeon that the moment you made yourself small, people believed you deserved to be. He studied her. Not the way Hargrove had studied her, with that oily calculation that made her skin crawl. This was different. This was searching. Like he was reading something written on her bones. "Melanie Ashford," he said. Not a question. Her name in his mouth sounded strange, too precise, like he'd been practicing it. "Who are you?" she asked. Her voice came out rougher than she wanted. 4 months of near silence would do that. Something shifted in those amber eyes. Surprise, maybe. Or something warmer. "Castiel Varenus," he said. "Alpha King of the Northern Reach." The words landed like stones in still water. The Alpha King. The ruler whose territories spanned from the Frost Mountains to the Silver Coast. The man whose name was spoken in whispers across every province in the realm, because even the most powerful lords feared what happened when they drew his attention. And he was standing in her cell. "Every prisoner in this keep has been released," he said, his gaze never leaving hers. "Every debt forgiven, every charge reviewed and dismissed." He pauses, and the torchlight caught the edge of that scar again. "Except yours." Melanie's breath hitched. "Why?" He extended his hand. His fingers were long, calloused, steady. "Because you're coming with me." She didn't take it. She stared at that hand like it might be a trap. Because in her experience, hands extended by powerful men always were. "I'm not going anywhere until you tell me why." A beat of silence, then the corner of his mouth twitched. Not quite a smile. Something closer to recognition. "Because Lord Hargrove falsified your charges to keep you buried here. Because he's used his authority to imprison 17 other women across his territories who refused his advances, and because your testimony is the key to bringing him before the High Council." Her testimony. Not her body. Not her compliance. Her words. She searched his face for the lie, for the hook hidden inside the bait. But his expression was open, patient. Like he would stand in this freezing cell for as long as it took for her to decide. "And if I say no? Then I unlock your cell. You walk out those gates. And you're free. Same as the others." He lowered his hand but didn't step back. "I'm not here to trade one cage for another, Melanie." The way he said her name the second time was softer. Like he was being careful with it. She stood. Her legs ached from sitting on cold stone, and she was thinner than she'd been 4 months ago, but she rose to her full height and looked him in the eye. He was at least a head taller than her, and up close. The controlled power radiating off him was almost physical. She could feel it like heat from a furnace, banked but immense. "I'll go with you," she said. "But I have conditions." That almost smile again. "Name them." "My mother and brother. They're in Millhaven, or they were. I need to know they're safe. Already being located. My scouts were dispatched yesterday." She blinked. Yesterday. Before he'd even arrived. Before he'd seen her face. "You were that sure I'd say yes?" "No." His amber eyes held hers. "I was that sure they deserved to be found regardless." Something cracked in Melanie's chest. Small. Quiet. Like ice breaking on a river at the first hint of spring. She stepped past him and out of the cell, and she didn't look back. The journey from Ashenmere to the northern reach took 3 days by carriage. The vehicle was well built, cushioned with thick furs that smelled faintly of cedar, and there was a basket of bread, dried fruit, and smoked meat waiting on the seat when she climbed in. Small kindnesses that felt enormous to a woman who'd been eating gruel and stale crusts for 4 months. Castiel rode alongside most of the way, mounted on a massive black stallion that moved like water over stone. He appeared at the carriage window at intervals to check on her, to point out landmarks, to ask if she was hungry or if the road was making her sick. He never climbed inside uninvited. He never assumed. Once, when the carriage hit a deep rut and lurched sideways, he was at the window before the wheels had even righted themselves. One hand braced on the frame, those amber eyes scanning her face for any sign of distress. She told him she was fine. He searched her expression for 3 full seconds before he believed her. On the first night, they stopped at a way station nestled in a grove of ancient birch trees. A fire was built in a stone ring that had clearly been used by travelers for generations, and the flames threw dancing shadows up into the white bark of the surrounding trunks. Someone handed Melanie a bowl of stew that was so rich and warm, thick with root vegetables and tender meat in a broth that tasted like someone had actually cared about the making of it, that she nearly wept. She sat on a log near the fire and ate in silence while Castiel's soldiers set up camp around them. They were efficient and quiet, moving with the practiced ease of men who had done this 100 times, and not one of them looked at Melanie with anything other than respectful acknowledgement. He sat down beside her. Not close enough to touch, but close enough that she could feel the warmth of him against the cold night air. He'd removed his cloak, and beneath the armor he wore a simple dark shirt, the sleeves rolled to his forearms. The firelight played across the ridges of his knuckles. "How long were you in that cell?" His voice was low, meant only for her. 4 months. She kept eating, give or take. His jaw tightened. She watched the muscle flex and release. "Hargrove's men intercepted 3 of my messages to the provincial magistrates. That's why no trial was ordered. He buried the correspondence and left you to rot." A pause. Pauses. "I should have come sooner." Melanie lowered her spoon. "You didn't know I existed until, what, a week ago?" 2 weeks. He stared into the fire. "A woman named Sarah Voss escaped Hargrove's household and made it to my border. She told my commander everything. Every woman Hargrove had taken. Every charge he'd fabricated." Those amber eyes shifted to Melanie. "She said you were the one who helped her plan the escape, that you did it from inside your cell by passing messages through a sympathetic guard." Melanie's grip tightened on the bowl. Sarah had made it. That stubborn, terrified girl had actually made it to the border. She was 16. He was going to... Her voice caught. She set down the bowl. She was 16. She's safe now. His hand moved, hesitated, then settled on the log between them, not touching her. Just there. "Because of you." The fire crackled. Somewhere in the trees, an owl called out and received no answer. "You should sleep," he said. "We have another full day of travel tomorrow." She should have. But instead, she sat by the fire for another hour, watching the flames and trying to understand why the most powerful man in the realm was sitting beside a miller's daughter in the dark, asking nothing of her at all. The northern reach was nothing like the provincial lowlands Melanie had grown up in. The capital, Thornhaven, rose from the base of the Frost Mountains like something carved from the stone itself. Towers of pale gray rock stretched toward a sky so blue it almost hurt to look at. The streets were clean, paved with smooth cobblestone that gleamed after a recent rain, and lined with shops whose windows glowed with lamplight even in the afternoon. The people moved with purpose. Women carried baskets of winter apples and fresh bread. Blacksmiths hammered at open forges, sending sparks into the cool air. And when Castiel's carriage rolled through the main gate, every guard they passed bowed not with fear, but with genuine respect. One of them, a young woman with her hair cropped short beneath her helm, grinned and called out something Melanie couldn't quite hear, and she caught the ghost of a laugh from Castiel on his horse ahead. This was not the kingdom of a tyrant. This was something else entirely. He brought her to a suite of rooms in the eastern wing of the keep. The chambers were warm, heated by a massive hearth already crackling with a fire that must have been lit in anticipation of their arrival. The walls were hung with tapestries in muted blues and silvers depicting mountain landscapes, and the bed was piled with furs so thick Melanie's hand disappeared when she pressed it into them. A copper tub stood in the adjoining room, steam still rising from the water someone had drawn. A wardrobe had been stocked with clothes in her size, deep plum woolens and ivory linens, a navy cloak lined with dove-gray silk, a pair of soft leather boots that looked like they'd been made by someone who understood that comfort mattered as much as beauty. "How did you know my measurements?" she asked, running her fingers along the sleeve of a plum-colored dress. "Sarah described you." He stood in the doorway, one shoulder against the frame, watching her explore the room with an expression she couldn't quite read. "She said you were the bravest person she'd ever met and approximately her height." "Approximately?" Melanie almost laughed. It felt foreign in her throat. "If anything doesn't fit, tell Marin. She'll have it altered within the day." He straightened. "The council hearing is in 5 days. Until then, you're free to go anywhere in the keep or the city. You're not a prisoner here." "You keep saying that." "Because I need you to believe it." Their eyes met across the warm room. The fire popped. And for a moment Melanie felt that strange pull again, the one she'd felt in the cell when he'd first looked at her. Like something invisible stretched between them. taut and humming. "Good night, Melanie." He said it quietly, reverently. Then he left, pulling the door closed behind him, and she stood alone in the warmest room she'd been in for months and pressed her hand against her sternum where something was buzzing like a plucked string. Over the next 4 days, Melanie learned 3 things about Castiel Vornus. The first was that he was feared for good reason. She watched him hold court one morning from a gallery above the throne room, and the way he addressed a lord who'd been caught hoarding grain meant for refugees made her blood run cold. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten. He simply stated what would happen, and the Lord's face went white as ash, controlled fury, absolute and precise. The second thing was that his people loved him, not feared him, loved him. She saw it in the way the kitchen staff smiled when he stopped to ask about their children, in the way his soldiers clapped his shoulder when formality dropped, in the way the city's children chased his horse through the square and he let them. The third thing was that he was lonely. She noticed it in the quiet moments, the way he ate dinner alone in his study most nights, the way he paused at windows and stared at the mountains like he was looking for something that wasn't there, the way his voice changed when he spoke to her, dropping its commanding edge and becoming something rawer, something almost uncertain. On the 4th evening, she found him in the library. He was sitting in a chair by the fire with a book open on his knee, but he wasn't reading. He was staring into the flames, and in the orange light, the scar on his face looked deeper, older. "Who gave you that?" Melanie asked, settling into the chair across from him without waiting for an invitation. He looked up. Those amber eyes caught the firelight and turned molten. "My father." The word landed between them with the weight of something carried for years. "He believed that an alpha's son should be marked early," Castiel continued, his voice low and even, "so he'd never forget what weakness cost." He closed the book. "I was 9. Melanie's chest ached. 9. A child. She thought of her own brother, who was 12, and something fierce and protective surged through her. "My father died when I was 11, she said. She hadn't planned to say it. The words just came, pulled out by the gravity of his honesty. He was sick for a long time before that. My mother ran the mill alone. I learned to do the books, manage the accounts. I was good at it." She paused. Pauses. Hargrove noticed. He wanted someone who could manage his estates. And when I said no, he decided that if he couldn't have my mind working for him, no one would. Castiel's hand curled into a fist on the arm of the chair. "He won't touch you again." "I know." She held his gaze. "Because I won't let him." The corner of his mouth lifted. There it was again. That almost smile that she was beginning to realize was his real one. The full smiles he gave in court were performance. This slight fracture in his composure, was genuine. "You're not what I expected," he said softly. "What did you expect?" "Someone who needed saving." "And instead?" He leaned forward slightly, firelight dancing across his features. "Someone who was doing the saving long before I arrived." The air between them felt like it was vibrating. Melanie became suddenly, acutely aware of how close their knees were, of the way his eyes dropped to her mouth and then back up, quick enough to be accidental, but slow enough to not be. She stood. "Good night, Castiel." His name felt significant in her mouth, heavy with something she wasn't ready to examine. "Good night, Melanie." Whispers. She left the library with her pulse hammering and her skin prickling, and the absolute certainty that she was in over her head. The council hearing arrived like a storm. The great hall of Thornhaven was packed. Lords and ladies from 12 provinces filled the tiered galleries, their faces a mixture of curiosity and political calculation. Magistrates sat at long tables with their quills poised over parchment. Scribes lined the walls. The hall itself was enormous, vaulted ceilings held up by pillars carved to look like ancient trees, their stone branches spreading overhead and meeting in the center. Banners bearing the sigils of every attending house hung from the galleries, and the light pouring through the tall arched windows turned the stone floor into a mosaic of gold and shadow. And at the center of it all, Lord Hargrove himself, dragged in from his territories in irons. His face was red with fury, his fine clothes rumpled from the journey, his hair unkempt in a way that would have humiliated a man who prided himself on appearances. When he saw Melanie standing at the witness platform in her plum dress with her hair braided back and her chin held high, his expression shifted from rage to something uglier, something that recognized she was no longer the starving woman in a cell he'd left to be forgotten. "That woman is a liar and a thief," he spat, straining against his guards. Castiel didn't even look at him. He sat on the throne at the head of the hall, dressed in formal black with the silver emblem of the Northern Reach across his chest, and his stillness was more terrifying than any shout could have been. Every lord in that gallery understood what that stillness meant. It meant he had already decided. It meant the trial was a formality for the sake of law, and the law would be satisfied. "You'll have your chance to speak," he said, his voice carrying across the stone chamber like a blade, "after she's had hers." Melanie told them everything. Her voice shook at first. She couldn't help that. And she gripped the edge of the witness stand until her knuckles went white. But she kept going. She told them about Hargrove's visits to the mill, the way he'd stand too close and speak too softly, and let his meaning hang in the air like poison. She told them about his offers that weren't really offers, about the night his soldiers came and dragged her from her home while her mother screamed from the doorway, and her brother tried to fight them off with a broom handle. She told them about Sarah Voss, about the other women, about the messages she'd smuggled through the guard named Pell, who'd risked his own life because he'd had a daughter the same age as Sarah, and couldn't live with himself if he did nothing. When she finished, the hall was silent. Not the silence of disbelief. The silence of reckoning. Then Hargrove lunged. He broke free from his guards with a violence that shocked the entire room, knocking one soldier sideways and grabbing a ceremonial blade from the belt of another. The crowd erupted. People screamed, stumbled back. But Hargrove wasn't heading for the door. He was heading for Melanie. She saw him coming, saw the wild hatred in his eyes, the blade catching the light from the high windows. Her body locked for one terrible second. Then she moved. She grabbed the iron candelabra from the witness stand and swung it hard. It connected with his forearm, and the blade went skittering across the stone floor. He staggered, snarled, and reached for her throat. He never made it. Castiel was there. He moved faster than a man his size had any right to, crossing the distance from the throne in what felt like a single heartbeat. His hand closed around Hargrove's wrist and twisted, and the sound Hargrove made was not a sound Melanie ever wanted to hear again. Castiel drove him to his knees with controlled, devastating efficiency, one hand on the back of his neck, pressing his face toward the floor. "Look at her." Castiel's voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried. Every person in that hall heard it. "Look at the woman you tried to destroy." Hargrove's eyes, wild and watering with pain, found Melanie's. She stood over him, candelabra still in hand, heart pounding, alive. "I am not your property," she said. Her voice didn't shake this time. "I never was." The council's verdict was unanimous. Hargrove was stripped of his title, his lands, his authority. He would spend the rest of his days in the very dungeon system he'd used to imprison innocent women. The other survivors were already being located, freed, compensated. Justice. Real. Witnessed. Undeniable justice. The hall emptied slowly. Melanie stood at the window and watched the crowd disperse into the courtyard below, and she was still standing there when she felt him behind her. She always seemed to feel him now. A warmth at her back. A shift in the air. "You swung a candelabra at a lord," Castiel said. "Former lord." She turned to face him. He was close. Closer than he'd ever stood before. She could see the individual stitches in the collar of his black shirt. Could count the darker flecks in his amber eyes. Melanie. The way he said it. Like a prayer. like a promise. I need to tell you something. Her heart was hammering so hard she was certain he could hear it. Then tell me. I didn't come to Ashenmere just because of the case against Hargrove. He swallowed. She watched his throat move. When Sarah described you, what you'd done, how you'd risked everything to help a girl you barely knew, He stopped. Started again. I've spent my entire life surrounded by people who want power, who scheme and calculate and take. And then I heard about a woman in a dungeon who had nothing, and still chose to give everything she had to protect a stranger. His hand came up. His fingers hovered near her cheek, not quite touching, asking permission with the hesitation. She leaned into his palm. His skin was warm, rough with calluses, and the moment they touched, that humming thread she'd felt since the first day pulled taut and sang. I came for you, he said, his voice breaking at the edges. Not your testimony. You. She kissed him. She rose on her toes and pressed her mouth to his. And the sound he made, low and shattered and reverent, undid something inside her she'd been holding together with sheer will for months. His arms came around her, pulling her against his chest, and he kissed her back, like she was the answer to a question he'd been asking his whole life. Slow, deep, thorough. His hand cradled the back of her head, fingers tangling in her hair, and she gripped the front of his shirt and held on. When they finally broke apart, his forehead rested against hers. Their breath mingled. His thumb traced the line of her jaw. Stay, he whispered. Not as a witness, not as an obligation. Stay because you want to. I want to. Her voice was steady. Sure. But I'm not staying as someone who's kept. I stay as your equal, or not at all. Melanie. He pulled back enough to look at her, and his eyes were bright, fierce, burning with something that made her chest expand until she thought it might burst. You were never anything less. 3 months later. The Frost Mountains wore their first dusting of new snow, and from the window of the eastern suite, the whole world looked like it had been dipped in silver. Melanie stood at the glass with a cup of tea in her hands and watched the city below come alive in the early morning light. The market stalls were opening, their canvas awnings bright against the gray stone. Children were already chasing each other through the square, their laughter carrying upward on the cold air. Somewhere, a baker was pulling bread from an oven, and the scent drifted up through the cracked window like a benediction. On the desk behind her sat a stack of trade documents she'd been reviewing the night before. The Eastern Route restructuring had been approved by the council 2 weeks ago, and the first shipments under the new system were already showing results. Faster delivery, fairer prices for the villages along the route, and a surplus that would carry 3 provinces through the winter without rationing. She'd done that. A miller's daughter with a head for numbers and a stubbornness that made Castiel's advisors alternately furious and deeply grateful. Arms slid around her waist from behind, warm, solid, familiar now in a way that still sometimes startled her with its tenderness. Your mother's letter arrived? Castiel's voice was rough with sleep, his chin resting on top of her head. She and Rowan are settled in the cottage near the Western Mill. She says Rowan has already made 3 friends and gotten into 2 fights. Melanie laughed, a real one, full and bright, and nothing like the foreign thing that had caught in her throat 3 months ago. That sounds like Rowan. His arms tightened. She felt his mouth press against her hair. The council approved the new protections yesterday. Any provincial lord found guilty of using false charges to imprison civilians will be stripped of title and territory. Sarah's testimony was the deciding factor. Sarah, 19 now, living in Thornhaven, training to become a legal advocate. Sometimes she came to dinner at the Keep and sat beside Melanie and talked with her hands the way she did when she was excited, and Castiel would watch them both with that quiet, molten expression that Melanie had come to understand was his version of joy. You built something, Melanie said, leaning back into his chest. The warmth of him seeped through the ivory linen of her sleeping shirt, and she felt his heartbeat against her shoulder blade, steady and strong. Something that will outlast both of us. We built it. He turned her gently to face him. Morning light caught his face, softening the scar, turning his eyes to liquid gold. None of this would have happened without you, without a miller's daughter who looked a lord in the face and said no. She reached up and traced the scar with her fingertip. He closed his eyes at the touch. Let her see the vulnerability he showed to no one else. I love you, she said. She said it often now. Every morning and every night, and sometimes in the middle of the day, just to watch the way his whole body softened when he heard it. He opened his eyes, cupped her face in both hands. I love you, Melanie. I love that you swung a candelabra at a lord. I love that you terrify my council members. I love that you organized my entire Eastern trade route in 2 weeks and somehow made it more efficient than anything my advisors managed in a decade. Former lord, she corrected. He kissed her, slow and warm and tasting like the morning. And against her lips, he smiled. A real one. Not the controlled expression he wore in court, or the almost smile she'd first seen in her cell. A full, unguarded, radiant smile that she had earned and that she would protect with everything she had. She pulled back just enough to look at him, at this man who had ridden through the night for a stranger's name, who had stood in a freezing cell and waited for her to decide, who had given her space and safety and time and never once demanded anything in return except the chance to stand beside her. You know, she said, running her thumb across his lower lip, when you walked into that dungeon, I thought you were just another powerful man who wanted something from me. And now? She smiled. Her real one. The one that had been buried beneath 4 months of stone and silence and had only resurfaced here, in this place, with him. Now I know you're a powerful man who lets me reorganize his entire trade infrastructure and doesn't complain when I stay up past midnight doing it. He laughed. A real laugh, deep and warm and rumbling through his chest and into hers. The sound of it filled the room and spilled out through the window and was carried away by the wind, out over the snow-covered rooftops of Thornhaven, out toward the mountains and the Silver Coast and all the places their story would eventually reach. Outside, the snow continued to fall, soft and steady and new.